Hello everyone, and I hope you can be joining us here in the Isle of Man, either live or maybe on a more sociable catch-up time. It's Friday, 7 p.m. here. Well, it's the Isle of Man RTS event, and I'm delighted to say we've got two very interesting guests to introduce you to. I'll just say, by the way, I'm Paul Moulton. I live here on the Isle of Man and have actually worked for Granada and BBC. But it's been the most fascinating story of covering this pandemic here, because it's a tale of two different areas completely. And first of all, I'd like to introduce my first guest, Lucy West, who's head of Granada News. Lucy, good evening.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here.
Maybe just start by introducing yourself and explaining a bit about you and your job, please.
Yeah, of course. So I'm Lucy West. As Paul said rightly, I am head of news for ITV Granada. So based at Media City, look after a team of just shy of 60 people covering news across the whole of the Northwest region. I started with Granada back, 2012. I came back, and we moved from our old studios at Key Street into new buildings at Media City. And obviously one of the first things that I had to do was find out about the Isle of Man. And Paul very kindly showed me around the island and introduced me to various drinking places, I think.
Thank you, Lucy. Thanks for that.
No problem. I mean, and that, you know, a great journey, as you said, started from there on in.
Okay, well, it's, as I say, two bizarre regions. You were in the Northwest, which is in all sorts of situations with lockdowns. Here, different story. And let me introduce you to Josh Stokes, who's the Isle of Man reporter for Granada. Josh, your first job in television, I understand, but do tell us a bit about what your responsibilities are.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. First job in television and on the Isle of Man of all places. So I'm the sole reporter for ITV News on the Isle of Man, specifically reporting for Granada Reports, as Lucy explained. So yeah, it's been an interesting time being on the Isle of Man, especially, you know, during the pandemic, arguably one of the biggest stories that many people have covered before. And obviously being the sole person here, it's been an amazing opportunity to, as a journalist, to cover it on your own, really. And I'm sure we'll be discussing more of that as we go along.
Well, I think a good place to start might be running one of your recent videos you did for ITV Granada. This is sort of between when we became COVID-free almost, isn't that where it starts, through to where we are today? Yeah,
so around the start of March, when we first got our first case on the Isle of Man, up until when the island became COVID-free at the start of June.
Okay, this is how it's reported on ITV Granada recently by Josh Stokes.
As we announced last night, the first confirmed case of COVID-19 has now been identified on the island.
Anyone arriving in the Isle of Man will be required to take immediate action. The 2020 Isle of Man TT is cancelled.
Tomorrow, all the schools on the island will close from the end of the school working day.
A package of measures will be introduced by the Treasury to support our workforce and protect the economy. We are entering a period where life will be different and must work together.
It's a worldwide pandemic, but every community has their story.
Until I got my results back, I was still convinced that I just had a cold. On the Isle of Man, we only have a small hospital, and we do have a large elderly population.
Good afternoon, 111 call centre.
Refuge on the horizon, an essential service in normal circumstances, but now needed more than ever.
We all need to do everything we can to delay the spread of infection.
One of the new recommendations from the UK is that people should now be wearing a face covering when entering places like shops. Has there been a reconsideration?
We will continue to make Manx decisions and find Manx solutions for our Manx situation.
That's the rule, it's fine. You know, we'll go by whatever rule. We just want to get back so we can start this 14 days and get back to our own homes and our own lives and work.
In the long term, everyone's going to suffer, aren't they, with economically, which we all will do, all the bars, all the restaurants. We'll just have to see how long this lasts for.
We are seeking to commence a carefully phased and structured return to work.
People are adapting to a whole new way of shopping.
We have tweaked things a little bit differently to allow customers to come in and to browse in the shop safely.
The virus is going to be with us long term, and we have to accept that.
Hopefully we have COVID relatively under control.
The anxiety is far less compared to how it started.
That's a lovely report there from Josh. I should point out for people who don't actually understand about the Isle of Man, we are a Crown dependency. Now that basically means we have our own government. So what you were seeing there was our Chief Minister doing these briefings to the media, and he closed the borders, and that was pretty early on. But we did have quite a few cases, Josh, didn't we? And you covered that.
Yeah, well, the summary video kind of shows the fascinating time that we've had on the Isle of Man, really. I mean, as it says at the start, it's a global pandemic, but the Isle of Man in particular has had its own story. And really, it's been an incredibly unique place to be covering the pandemic. We're the first place in the British Isles that removed social distancing for a start, and many other things followed on from that. But as you say, it has been that long journey, and covering it has certainly been a unique experience.
Lucy, I mean, normally the Isle of Man doesn't have that much probably visibility, but it's only what 1% of the actual coverage area. But has it been ranked up a bit higher because of all this, the differences?
I think it has been really useful for viewers across the Northwest to see how different places have coped with COVID and the virus. And I think, we can all learn from that. So I think seeing how an island community dealt with it, and the differences between what was happening in the UK and what was happening on the Isle of Man actually were quite stark. And I think it was really useful for us to have that. And I think the daily press conferences from the government, we've never had that before. We've never had those sort of regular briefings by the government. And I thought that was really interesting, and that sort of direct line of communication. So I think, it's the only story in town. It's the most important story. Loads of public service messages that we have to get out there. But, Josh covered a story just recently about the Food and Drink Festival, where there was 16,000 people and, no social distancing, and just the difference there that you can achieve over there compared to what's still happening over here, I thought was quite fascinating.
Well, Josh, you've been very dedicated because you are from the UK, but you've basically sort of been here, and well, you did get home for a little bit, and then I believe Lucy pulled you in to do a chit chat. Should we have a look at that when you were live in the studio at Granada just a couple of weeks ago?
Well, in a stark contrast to the rest of the Northwest at the moment, the Isle of Man has now reached 106 days without a new case of coronavirus. The Manx government announced further easing of restrictions a short while ago, and someone who's been across the island's coronavirus story from the start is our Isle of Man reporter, Joshua Stokes, who I'm glad to say joins me now in the studio. So, Josh, what's the latest from the government?
Well, and up until now, there's been a 14-day self-isolation policy where anyone entering the Isle of Man has been required to self-isolate for 14 days regardless of symptoms. But that has now changed from today. The government is giving people a choice where they can self-isolate for 7 days and take a test at the cost of £50. And if negative, they can then leave their home. However, there will be further restrictions. They will not be allowed inside indoor venues such as pubs and gyms in those further 7 or 6 days after that initial 7-day isolation. Interestingly, there was a chance for the government to loosen border restrictions further, but they felt the UK infection rate was too high to do that, and in which case borders will still only remain open at this point to Manx residents.
So the Manx government are continuing with their cautious approach and not ruling out that there could be cases coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you said, Anne, the Isle of Man hit a significant milestone over the weekend. 100 days with no new cases of coronavirus, a really significant milestone. And the Isle of Man decided to celebrate in the best way the Isle of Man can, which is sending a key worker parade around the TT course, showcasing the fantastic work that all the key workers have done during the Isle of Man pandemic story. But the government have said that any case could appear any day now, and that is key and that is important. But if people stick to the self-isolation, then it shouldn't spread within the community, and that's the message they're trying to get across. But after 106 days of no new cases, managing it in this way is key to the government to preventing any future outbreak in the future.
Yeah, they've done well so far. Josh, thanks very much for that.
And as I was saying, following that, when you came back, you then had to undertake your 14 days isolation, Josh?
Yeah, that's right. Well, it ended up being 7 days and then a test, obviously, after the announcement that was made. But that was actually a really unique moment, being, you know, in the Granada studios. But a press conference happened, and of course, we've been attending those press conferences as and when they've happened. They were every week, and then this one was called, and we were expecting some kind of change there. And it was either going to be, as I say, the board is changing to a different framework, which of course is the announcement we're all kind of waiting for and seeing what's going to happen with the borders now, or it was going to be that self-isolation change. And of course, as you say, it was the self-isolation change, and of course that changed my plans coming back to the Isle of Man, because obviously I'd have to self-isolate, which I was going to anyway, but then it was reduced to 7 days. And we really tried to make the most of getting that point across within that studio chat.
How do you get across that the Isle of Man is so different? Because I don't hear it out in the big wide world. You know, we are in the most incredible situation. I mean, we have threats in the sense of people have come back here, and we've had people get sent to prison here. I mean, these sort of stories they don't hear about in the UK, do they?
No, it's an interesting point as well, a really interesting point of how, as a journalist, you cover it within a region that is the majority built up of not people from the Isle of Man. So I always say you kind of always have to get a sentence in a report of, this is on the Isle of Man, this is how it's different. Because even now you're putting stories out about the prison sentences and about the Food and Drink Festival, as Lucy mentioned earlier. And you get people commenting saying, well, they should be socially distancing. Obviously, that's the reason the virus is so widespread, because they don't understand that it's a different place and it's a different part of the region, and there's different rules here. So it's always important. It's an additional element to the job that I think is very unique, where you have to kind of put that one sentence in to explain we are in a different place, there are different rules, we are on an island, because that brings its own difference to you know, the government that governs here. We're not governed by, you know, Boris Johnson. It's governed by the chief minister here, and that's a key difference that a lot of people don't understand. And it's really important to get that point across in reports, articles, in any way you can, really.
And how do you do that, Lucy? Because it is a juggling job, isn't it? Trying to squeeze the little Isle of Man into such a massive area, really.
Yeah, it is. But I think it's like anything, you know, the stories that we choose, we think are going to be the ones that are, you know, that are going to resonate with our viewers, you know, wherever they live in the Northwest. And I think, you know, COVID has shown that in many ways we're all going through this shared experience, but how it's being dealt with is a little bit different in different places. You know, all the different lockdowns, you know, in the north, you know, if you drive, you know, just 40 miles here, you will go through about 4 different sets of restrictions, and it's trying to kind of keep up with that. And I think it's setting everything in the context of, like Josh said, you know, the what's being done differently over there, and what difference is that making, you know, and can we learn from that? I think that's been really key. And
how have you managed to keep all the wheels turning for yourselves? Because I mean, you know, in Salford, of all places, one of the higher areas, you know, Northwest. What's it been like for you? Yeah, well, touch wood. So far, we haven't had any positive tests within the news team. Obviously, we have within ITV, but I think it is about, you know, we kind of had to change the way we worked. Literally, you know, in a couple of weeks, to make sure that we were still safe to operate. You know, what normally would have taken probably 3 months to plan, we just had to get on with it. And that was the 2 meter social distancing. So it was taking people out of the gallery, out of the studio, to make sure we went to single presentation. So all of these things, you know, you have to think through everything. So obviously we already do a risk assessment process for every job that we do. And again, we've done a special COVID risk assessments, and making sure that, you know, all the contributors that
that we talk to. A lot of stuff we do now on Zoom and Skype, which again, you know, some things you think, why didn't we do this before? You know, if somebody is the right person to answer that question, ordinarily pre-COVID times, we'd have, you know, they might have gone, oh, but they're in London or they're in Bristol, so we can't get to them. But now you can use Zoom and Skype, and the viewer accepts that actually you can get to the right people to ask them the questions.
Josh, dealing with the Manx government, they have a communications department.
Yeah.
As you know, it's still on Zoom here. It's something that I kind of wonder why we're not in the same room anymore. But how's it been to cover the story here? Because I think it's fair to say it's quite controlling. Is that probably a big word to use? But you know, the government, were they helping you? Were they insisting you on covering the story? Let's try that.
It's an interesting point, an interesting way of describing it. I mean, the government have had, you know, that it's all new to them. These press conferences have been completely new to the government, as it's been new to journalists here. And it's getting that balance right of what's not the right way of doing it, but the way they want to do it and the way we get our messages across. And if anything, I think the press conferences here have raised the profile of the Isle of Man as a whole. And I think they've helped the journalists here, again, as a whole. And we've discussed this many times before, and we had another panel talking mainly about the press conferences. But on the whole, I think that the government have used the press conferences to try and get that message across. And it's been good for journalists like ourselves to actually question that with an audience as well. That's not something that's ever happened before. I know you mentioned before the press conferences, we had our maybe Friday meetings with the Chief Minister or other people doing those meetings. But now, getting that opportunity to get it in the public domain, obviously it goes out live, our questions go out live, the feedback we get is live, and getting that experience between the both of us and that communication is important. There's a whole other debate of whether we should be in the room or whether we should be on Zoom. That's something that will be an everlasting debate,
That's my pet one,
sure.
Isn't it? I'll move on from that. I get stuck on that one. But you use social media a lot. I mean, you put your reports onto Granada, and you've also worked for Channel Television in, you know, part of the ITV region in the Channel Islands. There's been a lot of cooperation there, hasn't there?
Well, the great story, of course, from the pandemic is this air bridge that the Isle of Man's now got. The Isle of Man has never been so connected with Guernsey. So, you know, it's been a great thing.
So we can, in the Isle of Man, get on a plane, although we have to put a mask on the plane for some peculiar reason, but we can go to Guernsey and we can just walk around again, absolutely as if nothing's happened. And these two islands are showing this unique moment. But you've been feeding them material. They've sent footballers over here and that sort of thing. You've been covering sports and all sorts, haven't you?
It's been a connection that's never happened before. And for us, you know, as ITV Channel, they're usually playing with Jersey and Guernsey, and they're talking about stories between there. Now they're actually including the Isle of Man, which is, again, it's the third crown dependency. It's the other crown dependency that they've never really touched before. And being able to connect Guernsey and the Isle of Man in that way has opened up a whole new range of stories to cover. Like, as you say, the football's been one of them. You know, we had Guernsey Man over here, which has just been a hit for them, especially over there.
Please explain that to the audience, just briefly, because it was a gem. I mean, Lucy, you bet you couldn't believe your luck when you got Josh sending you back pictures and the interview.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so basically, it was the first flight that came in from Guernsey. And it was the first group of Guernsey residents that were visiting the Isle of Man, and this gem of a man got off the plane, and we were there waiting for them and asking, you know, how was the flight? And the flight was 2.5 hours delayed, I think, at the time. And these poor people had just come from sunny Guernsey, and the Isle of Man was in the classic Isle of Man grey fashion. You know, it was very cloud over. I think it was raining at the same time. And this man came over, and I just simply asked him a few questions. I said, "What's your first impression of the island?" And he said, "Well, it looks like February at the moment." And he was just this most blunt man speaking about it. And it just that story blew up, and he became a celebrity.
And the point is, you tagged him, you hashtagged him, it went viral. I mean, Lucy, this is your sort of dream, isn't it? Those sort of stories that take off like that from nothing.
Absolutely, and it is realizing their potential, because poor Josh, I was hounding him saying, you've got to follow this man, find out where he's been, you know, what's his favorite pub now, what's his favorite walk on the Isle of Man, and he has actually come back several times, Josh, hasn't he?
He's been back at least once, and unfortunately it was when I was self-isolating, otherwise I would have seen him. So it was the time when he did come back. But it's just the great thing about that story in particular is it linked, as I say, linked Channel with the Isle of Man. And he became a celebrity because of it. And my favourite thing from it, above all else, which is you learn so much about the Isle of Man being here, but my favourite thing was tweeting the day after that he'd landed, and we had that discussion, and it kind of went Manx viral overnight. I just tweeted to say, if anyone sees him, I'd love to know if he's having a good time now, if he's enjoying himself. Within 2 minutes, someone got back to me saying, yeah, he's sitting in my restaurant, the starters have gone down well, and we're hoping for a good night going forward. And then by then, he was just spotted all over the place. And
he's now known as Guernsey Man, even on Guernsey, I understand. So
yeah, and he's just a fantastic character, and something, I mean, you can prepare a report, in full. You can spend hours preparing a report and try and craft it to make it the best thing you can possibly make. But something like that comes out and you're not expecting it, and it becomes the most popular viewed thing that you've ever put together. But it's just those moments that are just fantastic, and it's just one of those brilliant moments from the coverage.
Before I let you go, I'd like to just finish on another report that you've done. It's a year since, I again explain to the people listening and watching this overseas, that's how we call it. We had a massive amount of flooding a year ago, almost to the day.
Yeah.
And it was one of the big stories that did make national news, I think, as well. And you were there covering it, Josh, and you got the report. I think we can see this, how you summed it up. So let's run that now. Josh, on the floods.
For many in the Isle of Man, their village has been seriously damaged.
There's a lot of work to do inside. We never expected it. We got up thinking it was a normal day, and ended up bailing water out the house by 9 o'clock.
For the Isle of Man, frequent storms from the Irish Sea are a usual occurrence, but something like this hasn't been seen for years.
They know they've got the floods coming. There was an amber weather warning that night, and they did nothing. They just haven't learned their lessons.
The digger here will be lifting wood and debris out of the river, while people in their houses are removing the damage that was caused by the flood yesterday. Can you assure people that action will be taken based on the extremity of this flood?
Absolutely. And the more debris that ends up in the river, the more chance there is for a blockage further downstream, and the water levels could rise. His property was one of the worst affected.
Looking out the back window and seeing the amount of water, it was really, really scary. It's life or death, really.
I'm terribly concerned because now every time when we have rain, I'm sitting up through the night. I'm waiting for it to happen again.
After an independent review into the floods, it was recommended the government took greater precautions to prevent future flooding.
I would agree with the community that up until 12 months ago there hadn't been sufficient action.
And an update on that story, the Isle of Man government has just announced it's making payments of £500 available to residents who have flooded out of their homes in Laxey.
But as this village once again enters the flooding season, complete reassurance for residents 1 year after such devastation seems a long way off yet. Joshua Stokes, ITV News, Laxey.
And that story goes on. Josh, good report. That was really in the deep end there. Sorry, excuse the pun.
Yeah, it was. The reason I wanted to show that is because it was an important story that we've covered from start up to where we are now. And there were lots of different bits of reports that were put into that summary piece that kind of show a bit of a journey going forward. But what was key about the Laxey floods back when it happened, a year ago, yesterday it would have been, was that it had national attention from ITV News National, and some of the shots that we shot there got on national, and it just shows that connection between the Isle of Man and the rest of ITV News, that when it matters, there is a connection there, and there is a bridge that can be made there, and there are important stories here that do get told on a national scale, not just a regional scale, but a national scale as well.
And where did you put that in the running order, Lucy, that night? Do you remember when it happened?
The Laxey floods, when it first happened,
yeah, it
was top story. That those pictures were lead. They were in the headlines on the network news. So yeah.
Not very often, Josh. I guess you got to fight for the first position when you got such a big region. Must be quite tough.
Well, naturally, yeah, of course. It's as you said, it's 1% of, around 1% of the population of Granada is the Isle of Man, but it's finding those stories that are appealing to the whole region, the whole of the Northwest, and floods are always something that's going to make people go, wow, look at that, that's the shots of people's, house being devastated in many ways, and the people's stories of how they cope with that, and importantly, coping with that in the long term, which is why we've been back and we did a year on peace, because it's important to see the floods aren't just an on-the-day thing. These people have had to suffer through the whole year, and they've only recently been able to move back into their own home. And that's something that isn't just going to appeal to people on the Isle of Man. People have been flooded in the Northwest, and it's comparing the two regions like that.
Okay, well, we've gone over time, and I'm sure you've got things to be doing on a Friday night. But Lucy, how's it been for audiences during this pandemic? I hear that everyone's switching on to the regional news, which must be, good news for you.
Absolutely. So we've seen both ourselves and the BBC locally have seen, amazing ratings. So, 30% share between the two of us, we're seeing on average about 500,000 people tuning in every night. So that's been incredible, but I think it just shows there's a real hunger for people to try to understand, what the latest is coming out from government, what the changes are in terms of travel restrictions, where they can, where they can't go, when they have to self-isolate. So it is, it's not going to go away. I think as in that very first report that we saw from Josh, somebody said, this is the virus and we're going to have to learn to live with it. I think that is so true. So we've got, those important messages carry on. We've got a really important job to do. So, yeah.
Well, I was going to say the future of regional news. I mean, ITV's had its ups and downs with ideas and plans and sharing content between the areas. I think Granada and London were immune from that. But do you feel secure that the future is still on terrestrial television, not, edging towards the internet?
I think we have to be on both, to be honest. I think, you've got a particular audience that is watching at 6 o'clock and tuning in every night, and those ratings are going up, not down, so that's brilliant. But equally, we're growing audiences online. Josh has done an amazing job in terms of Facebook and on social media, and you've seen that audience grow. We're doing Instagram now. So, the audience that we have online is very different to the audience that we have on television, and I think it's understanding that and repurposing your content for those particular audiences.
Okay. And Josh, as I said at the beginning, your first job, you couldn't have picked a more interesting place, I guess, in the end, as it turned out.
Absolutely. I always say how lucky I am to have chosen the job here at the right time, doing all the things I do, self-shooting, self-editing, on a story this big that's been ongoing for so long, and being able to film that and manage your own social media, as Lucy said, is important for the Isle of Man in particular. Paul, the Isle of Man is basically run off Facebook. It's an important bit of the service to have that Facebook page to appeal to people that are looking for just those Isle of Man stories, and it does boost the numbers on social media, and that is important.
Okay, well,
and
thank you very much,
one
both
thing, if I can say, is I think you can tell from the way that Josh talks, he enjoys his job. He's very good at it, and he's proved that. But I think you do enjoy it, Josh, don't you?
Yeah, it's a fascinating place. I'll always say it's a fascinating place. I've learned so much having been here. Being on the Isle of Man, being on an island, so much more than you even thought you could learn being on the Isle of Man. And nothing, honestly, nothing I will say now will explain how bizarrely brilliant this place is as a journalist, and there's a place to report on things, regardless of stories of the pandemic. Just the Isle of Man in general is a fantastic patch to work on.
I have a horrible feeling, though, you'll be snapped up by some other area, or ITN will beckon you, I should imagine. But anyway, it's great to talk to you both, and thank you, because we have gone over time. I just want to thank you and explain to everyone watching that the Isle of Man RTS is a very small new region, and we're always looking for new members. So please do check on the website if you would like to join us and support the media in the Isle of Man, because we've got many more stories to tell. And once again, Lucy, thank you very much for joining us from Salford, and also Josh down the road somewhere.
Down the road.
It's Friday night, so he'll be in the bar no doubt in a few minutes. As I'm sure Lucy might be. I shouldn't.
No, I can't go to one.
No, of course
I'm
you can't.
home. Yeah.
Now that's, you see, we are having the most weird time, because we go to bars, they don't shut early. It is the most bizarre, isn't it? Let's finish with Josh. This bubble is hard to explain to people.
Really, it's difficult to. You can only show it in the shots, really. As Lucy said, it's the food and drink festival, the crowds. You look at that and you think there's very, very few places in the world that will have shots like this, and they're on the Isle of Man of all places, where a lot of people probably don't even know where the Isle of Man is, and yet it's here that you're getting the strange occurrences that are strange now, but they were normal back, so many months ago, and this is now the place that's showing those shots.
And what I love about this is history in the making, isn't it? This is
Absolutely.
all going to be one day played back and go, wow.
Yeah.
But the second wave might hit here. The story might change at any time. We can't.
Of course, it's not. That's a key point, actually. The coronavirus story isn't over here. It's ongoing. It's different, and it always was different to the rest of the Northwest. But it is ongoing here, and things clearly will change in some way or the other on the Isle of Man, and that's why it's good to keep that coverage going and keep attending the press conferences as we do.
And just explain to viewers that the Isle of Man basically is still in lockdown. People can come back, but they do have to self-isolate. And there have been key workers that have ended up, as we mentioned, in trouble. And we just, here they prefer, seem to be a jailing sentence. Other jurisdictions like Guernsey like to fine people more than anything, but the borders are still up. It's going to be an ongoing story. Anyway, my thanks also to Sam Bowers, who's been doing the technicals on this. My thanks to everyone for watching, and it's on catch up, and that's probably better to watch it later. And we'll do another one soon. But again, to my panel, thank you very much indeed for joining us.